In part 2 of this one-part series, we watched Christian excusagist Sean McDowell experience some serious cognitive decline as he couldn't remember some basic things about the tribal war god of Abraham and the morality that God heaped upon the world. Let's pick up where we left off, though I should be clear, we're not looking at this entire interview. It's just too long. Sean and Michael next move to the classic Euthyphro dilemma.
Do the gods command something because it's good, or is it good because the gods command it? Now, in one sense, we would say if something's good because he commands it, then morality seems arbitrary. And you lay that out in your article, I think, really well. If the source is simply God's will, then morality is arbitrary. But if God commands something because it's good, then that follows there's some authoritative source and existence outside of God, which threatens God's sovereignty and status as God, so to speak. So is it A or is it B? Now, I think the Euthyphro dilemma is a legitimate dilemma for certain Islamic views that have really God's commands alone as the source of morality. And I know some Christians might take that perspective. I think it's definitely a challenge in the day of Socrates to the Greek pantheistic view, or pantheon of gods, in which these gods were capricious, unpredictable. They were creatures in the universe. They were finite, and they did horrific things. It would apply to the gods of his day, but not the God that I'm claiming here, because God is just in his very character.
Hold it right there. We have another case of Godzheimer's. You know, if Sean wanted to make up a God who was all good and just and loving, that would be one thing. But Sean is talking about the tribal war god of Abraham. We have his rap sheet, and it's every bit as horrific as the Greek gods, including the impregnation of young girls without their consent. To say nothing of the slavery, the genocide, and etc.
So it's not arbitrary because his commandments flow out of his nature, but there's also not a standard outside of God because God is good. So I don't see why the Euthyphro dilemma undermines the divine command theory that I hold.
It's nice to see Sean moving on from the Godzheimers, even if he has replaced it with pure sophistry. That was really nothing more than a bait and switch. He simply replaced the word will with the word nature, and voila, problem solved, right? He also just pushed back the fences, leaving us now to ask, how can we objectively determine that God's nature is good? And can God command something that is contrary to his nature? If so, we still don't know what makes God's commands good. And here, let's not Godzheimer's this ourselves. Sean is not talking about some imagined God, but the Christian God, whose record is clear. So let's take the most obvious case, in my mind. Sean's God commanded the murder of young women who fail to produce evidence of virtue on their wedding nights. God's nature may be good, but this command is clearly rotten to the core, as God would have certainly known that a woman's hymen can break prior to intercourse and even remain intact after intercourse. Sean tries to keep his God as abstract as possible, unmoored completely from the tribal war god of Abraham presented to us in his Christian holy book. That's a clever tactic, but it's disingenuous at best. We have example after example of God's commands being anything but good, which I guess is in conflict with his nature. Sean also forgets that the Bible is constantly patting you on the back with the left hand while it's punching you in the sack with the right. For instance,
it's not that I'm trying to reach in, the afterlife, heaven or hell. That's not the point. The question is, do we have built within the system as it is a way to explain rights way to explain value, human intrinsic value, not just instrumental value. And of course, within the Judeo-Christian system is there's a God who's made us in his image.
Yes, Sean's God has allegedly made us in his image, whatever that means, which sounds nice. But it clearly says nothing about our intrinsic value, as God kicks the humans out of paradise and into a world filled with... Dan?
This life is filled with an immeasurable amount of injustice and suffering.
Thank you. And for simply being deceived by a talking snake, prior to our first parents having any understanding whatsoever of good and evil. Intrinsic value? Not so much. Fast forward a few chapters and the flood story clearly demonstrates that humans and animals have no intrinsic value. Short of our instrumental pleasing of God and living the way he wants us to live, whether or not God's ways align with our wants, needs, or well-being. Humans are absolutely worthless to God and his creation. Even worse, our worthlessness brings God's wrath on the animals as well, who do absolutely nothing but follow their nature, kind of like humans did for hundreds and thousands of years. And by the way, who created that human nature? For the evangelical Christians, things look even worse, as they will tell you that we are lower than low and completely deserving of eternal conscious torment, merely for existing, simply for being born into this world entirely without our consent. This is how intrinsically valuable humans are in the eyes of the Christian God. Though in all fairness, I imagine hell costs a pretty penny to keep running, so I understand God's desire to get some use out of it.
It would seem to imply, on the flip side of this, that if we could talk people into believing certain things that are not really in their best interest, but they believe it, then we justify different treatments of people on the system that you're kind of setting up here. So you say this at the end of your article, and I'd love your thoughts on this. You said, first off, you say, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Totally agree. You and I have commonality in that.
Sean really keeps topping himself on the Godzheimer scale.
Godzheimers.
This one's off the charts too, because his source of moral grounding, the tribal war god of Abraham, would be smacking both of them right upside the head now if he existed. God is totally okay with chattel slavery. Another example of God's allegedly all-good nature being in conflict with his commands, leaving us once again without a way to know objective right from wrong. Just ask these clowns. Here's Michael's best point from the discussion.
So I'm arguing in the moral arc that these kind of Enlightenment arguments from reason and rationality about rights and duties and so on, and the structure of society, democracy and whatnot, separation of powers, are grounded in an understanding of human nature and what societies are really like in history. Again, the founding fathers were very learned. They read everything because there wasn't that much to read.
Sure. And
they were all classically trained. Really, today we would think of them as natural philosophers or social psychologists or something like that. But my argument there is that Christianity itself, or the Judeo-Christian worldview, was affected by that. It went through the Enlightenment and came out the other end much more tolerant and liberal and so on. The people before that, Christians before that, would not be speaking the way you're speaking. They thought nothing of slavery was perfectly understand. Everybody did it. The only problem was just as long as it didn't happen to you. And I can't say honestly that if you and I lived 500 years ago, we wouldn't be saying, yeah, of course slavery is natural and that's the way it should be for those people. And, the way Christians treated the Jews and thought of Jews all the way up until really pretty recently. And I won't even get into October 7th and how.
Yeah, please don't for now.
Lost their minds. So what I'm saying is that the stuff you're saying now that you think you're deriving through your religion, I'm arguing you didn't. You and I and everybody else living today have inculcated into our thought processes these values that have changed over centuries, in which it's been a hard one. I mean, the rights revolutions happened, twice, basically, in the 1770s and 80s, and then in the 1960s and 70s, the two major rights revolutions, and the humanitarian revolution that derived after those, that came about from those, in which the moral sphere was expanded to include more people, and we're more tolerant about blacks and women and Jews and so on. That has happened slow enough you can't barely see it. It's like a decadal measure of time, or even centuries. And so the language you and I are using here, in which we find some common ground, we probably would not be speaking like that had we lived centuries ago. So your claim that you're getting this through some outside objective moral universe from God or whatever, I don't think so.
Sean is right here. Christians did indeed ground their morality in the nature and commands of the tribal war god of Abraham. They practiced slavery because their God allowed it. They committed genocide and robbed native peoples of their lands and resources because their God allowed it. They locked up and murdered those who pushed back against the various wretched doctrines of the church because, well, their God allowed it. There are ways to ground our morality without looking to God and his alleged commands. Sean does this kind of by reinterpreting his holy book and putting a modern post-Enlightenment spin on it, causing a frightful case of Godzheimer's. Unfortunately, the Christian ethno-nationalism Sean's holy book clearly inspires will never really die. Not as long as Christians continue to embrace and revere that holy book. So long as that book continues to be read and respected, we'll never be free of the vile morality given to us by the tribal war god of Abraham, which makes Sean part of the problem rather than the solution. Once again, I'm me. Thanks for watching.